is said that there are 9 arts. And what if video games is the 10th? I'm Charles Adam Foster Simard from Ubisoft. You're listening to The 10th Art, a podcast series about the place of video games in entertainment, culture, and society. Video games are often places for fantasy, shooting bad guys, traversing beautiful landscapes, traveling to distant planets, or exploring dangerous dungeons. But to create that engagement with players and the feeling of immersion that we're all chasing when we play, authenticity plays a big part. Authentic weapons and gunplay in a shooter, authentic characters and dialogue, authentic cars in a racing game, authentic worlds to dive into. So, how do development teams ensure that they nail authenticity? What exactly do players expect in terms of authenticity and even realism in the games they play? And how do games walk the line between authenticity and fun? To discuss these questions, today on the show we invited Thierry Noël, who's Senior Manager Inspirational Content at Ubisoft, and Dr. Jacqueline Burgess, Lecturer in International Business at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. Hello, Thierry, and hello, Jacqueline. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello.
Hey, Charles.
It's a pleasure to have you. Thierry, you're with us in studio here in Paris, and Jacqueline, you're joining us remotely from your office in Australia.
That would be correct. Just to fit into all of the Australian stereotypes, I'm located on the Sunshine Coast.
Yes, I love it. I love the name of your university. So I want to give you just a chance to, briefly introduce yourselves. So we can start with you, Jacqueline, if you want.
Yeah, hey, so I'm Dr. Jacqueline Burgess. I teach and research at a university. So I teach marketing, international marketing, brand management, and research the marketing of narratives, often video games, but also other things like film series, book series. But also I am looking at what are the marketing skills of the people who create these kind of creative artifacts. So it's the marketing of the creative artifacts, but also the marketing skills of the people behind them.
Really interesting area of research and totally new to me. So it's very exciting to get the chance to talk to you. And Thierry, you're part of a team at HQ that supports a lot of development teams around the world at Ubisoft, right?
Exactly. We were formerly known as the Research Unit, and we now have a new name, which is GSI Humanities and Inspiration, GSI for Global Strategic Insights. And our goal, as you said, is to support the team in their research, especially in the fields of history, geography, all kind of elements that could provide authenticity and immersion to the games.
I think many people maybe don't realize that we have this support team at Ubisoft doing all of this really important work and supporting our development teams with that research. So it's very interesting. So our topic today is, authenticity, and we want to take this topic very broadly. So maybe I just wanted to begin by asking both of you, how do you define the concept of authenticity, specifically in video games and maybe a little bit more broadly in entertainment? But what does that term and that concept mean to you? Thierry, if you want to start.
Well, I think Jacqueline has a lot to say. Will be much more, how to say, subtle and a deeper explanation of it. But the fact is, we also have our own conception of authenticity. In our case, we perceive it as a perception of accuracy, even if it's not exactly accurate. Element that can provide a much more immersive experience to the players, and when in our fields, when dealing with us, especially about history in a broad meaning, in a broad sense of history.
Yeah. And what about you, Jacqueline?
I really like that point about how it's the perception of accuracy, since I think you really need to differentiate between what is authentic and what is actually accurate, because they sound the same and they're very easy to conflate, but they actually can mean very different things. Accuracy is fact, right? And authenticity, though, is more about the feeling. Maybe it's not necessarily strictly accurate, but it kind of captures the flavor or the tone or the mood or the atmosphere of, say, in a historically based video game in the historical setting. I really like that you mentioned how broad authenticity is. When we look at it from a research perspective, we would actually break authenticity into 3 different types of authenticity. So we would have historical authenticity. So is something accurate, authentic to the historical time period? So is this, a Picasso painting, for example? It is or it isn't. It's pretty easy to say yes or no. There's a criteria. But we would also have categorical authenticity, which I think is what we've just talked about, where it's all about the perceptions. It's not a strict black and white yes or no criteria. It's about your perceptions of being authentic. So to take the Picasso painting, Picasso is very well known for his, cubist kind of artwork, right? But he also did landscapes, and he did much more realistic portraits as well. So people might not think that is an authentic Picasso, even though, it is a Picasso. And then finally, we also have what we call conformity authenticity or values authenticity, and that's about the motivations of the person behind it. If, say, someone was motivated very much, for money. So think, again, the Picasso, great artist, very widely regarded and respected for obvious reasons. But let's say if someone found out that Picasso did some of his most famous works purely to be motivated for the money, for the paycheck, and obviously I'm not saying that, but if someone found out that or thought they found out that, that might influence or impact on their feelings of the authenticity of his work and of his paintings. So, authenticity is that broad. We can indeed split it into multiple different ways, which all have very different meanings depending on what you're looking at and what you mean by authenticity.
That's fascinating because that's exactly what we aim at. We're aiming at, as you say, all the different aspects of authenticity. And in all cases, knowing that what we are doing is a work of reconstruction. And trying to find all the sources, all the elements to reconstruct everything from details and material details to more non-material aspects, as we say, dynamics, values, that kind of thing which are sometimes difficult to represent.
Well, Thierry, since we have you here, I'd like to ask you to explain a little bit what your work entails concretely. So can you give some examples of some games you've worked on and, some material that your team has collected or done research on to help bring a game to life and, as you say, reconstruct either a place or a historical period, be it as it may, to make it feel authentic?
Well, I've been working at Ubisoft since 5 years now, or a bit more, bit more than 5 years. I've been working on Ghost Recon Wildlands, which took place in Bolivia, on Far Cry 6, took place in a fantasy island. I will say in Yara, a fantasy island of the Caribbean, of modern day Caribbean, and I've been working in AC Valhalla and all its expansions. So a focus on the Viking Age, especially in Anglo-Saxon England. Mm-hmm. And basically our job is to support the team providing all kinds of elements they would need, which range from the slightest detail to much broader elements of comprehension of interpretation of the periods. We work on everything. We try also to find what the teams have not done, because they're doing a lot of research, but they can't see everything. So we can also to shed light on things they would have missed. A good example, typically for me, of what we do, I like this one. We work on many things. I like to think that we provide many information. But for example, in Valhalla, AC Games need elevation. The teams wanted some sort of castle which did not exist at the time.
Towers and
exactly
cliffs and to jump off of. Right?
Exactly. That's the point of AC. A major point of AC is to climb and to observe. And so we talked to them about all the Roman vestige, because something many people ignore, but yes, there's a huge Roman legacy in Anglo-Saxon England, and there was at that time huge Roman legacy from the Hadrian Wall, of course, in the north, but also many elements starting with London itself. Yeah. So we told them that yes, you can use many Roman ruins to have elevation, and well, this was a good substitute for elevation, and when you don't have castle, and it was rather accurate, historically speaking.
So you bring them inspiration in the large sense, and to create something authentic, but you also sometimes help them solve problems, right?
Exactly, and that's a nice part of the job, also to solve small detailed problems.
Jacqueline brought up this concept of the categorical authenticity, and I'm going to reuse your example, Jacqueline, because you mentioned a Picasso. What we imagine as a kind of classic, as it were, Picasso painting is not everything that Picasso produced, right? He also produced some paintings that were more realist, for example. So do we have that issue sometimes in video games where maybe the expectation of the audience is for a certain representation of, a historical period or a place or even a character versus the real facts of that place or that person? Do those sometimes not quite line up and you have to change, either surprise a character or change the representation in order to fit the expectations and not pull the player out?
It's all about the expectations, right? And how far can you push a player or a consumer's expectations? Because part of the reason why people in general, not even necessarily video game players, but why people love historical fiction or, like true crime, for example, it's about, the verisimilitude, the suspension of disbelief. You don't have to suspend, you don't have to imagine because it happened. And it's about then trying to sometimes put yourself or put the reader in the perspective of these people. It's about then the reader almost getting to know more about themselves, more about the world they live in, because these experiences that they're reading about or listening about or playing through actually happened. So you don't necessarily want to fiddle things too much to that degree, because then it starts to lose some of that magic and some of the benefit that comes from that historical realistic fiction, because all it takes is a quick Google search on their phone while they've got the game menu paused, and then the whole kind of thing starts crashing down. On the other hand, it's a game, it needs to be fun, and that is where in video games we also talk about something called selective authenticity, and that's about very careful foregrounding of what you want to keep accurate and what you want to say jettison. So I think a great example of that for Assassin's Creed was Black Flag. The ship-to-ship combat is not, too bad from a historical perspective. It's just, say, really, 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 really sped up.
Right.
Which, if you kept it really accurate, it's not going to be a lot of fun, right? And do people particularly matter if the ship combat is a bit sped up? Probably not. If a major character, though, is acting completely contradictory to the historical record that we know of, maybe that's then going to have some issues for them. Sometimes the joy of historical fiction is actually having some of your assumptions sort of shattered. So Assassin's Creed Odyssey, for example, and just general with ancient Greece, we think of ancient Greek statues as being these perfect white marble things, but they were actually heavily decorated and heavily painted, and it's just the paint's worn away over time. That's a lovely little foregrounding that could have thrown people off because it doesn't look like what they expect. But it's actually also a really great, almost, learning or moment, or I suppose, trivia moment as well to win a trivia game down the local pub as well. And also, gives that little touch to the player that the world they're, going through has been very carefully created and carefully foregrounded, and helps them build that trust and get those benefits in those areas. So it's always this tricky balancing act without going, too far one way or the other, because then you do lose people. Doesn't matter kind of what fiction it is, you lose people if you do push it too far.
Thierry, does that speak to you, this, balancing act between foregrounding certain things and then adjusting certain things for the element of play and fun?
Absolutely. I think one does not imagine all the talks about every details that we need to have, and as Jacqueline said, for many aspects to maintain fun, sometimes for technological issues too. There's plenty of elements that we need to take into account to make the right decision. How should we represent something, which might be from a building to people to a conversation too, and values of a period? How Can we do it respecting expectations and at the same time trying to aim at accuracy? And obviously the example of ship navy battles is excellent. It's the same for riding horses. I mean, one would not spend 3 days riding a horse until north of Greece in a game. It will be accurate, but possibly boring. But in other case, yes, we do have to take decision. And we're thinking about the Cathedral of Notre Dame.
Yeah,
that we've put the flesh of
yes.
the Olympic, which only came later after the French Revolution, but people were definitely expecting it.
Right, because the building almost doesn't look like itself without the spire, right? It looks strange.
The spire makes it all. So we finally decided to include it, even if we knew it was not in the Cathedral of the Mo. So yes, there's plenty of talks about it.
I'm pulling this from memory, but I think there was a developer on Assassin's Creed Origins, which is set in ancient Egypt, that was saying he had like a 30-second rule, right? Like if it took more than 30 seconds to Google and find the right answer for a fact, then he thought it was a safe space to kind of operate in, right? If you have to dig a little bit more in Wikipedia to get the right info, then you're like on that safe side of being accurate enough, but you can kind of play around with some things. Jacqueline, you were talking about expectations also of the audience, and I know you've written about this, the fact that maybe some players think that they want more authenticity than they actually enjoy when they're playing the game. Can you say a little bit about that? Because I thought it was a really interesting concept.
Yeah, it always goes back to that balancing act, because we know that people who are consuming, historical fiction, they want their accuracy, they want the facts, they enjoy the learning experiences. We know that with people who read historical novels as well, right? But particularly with, say, a video game where you also have, the mechanics and the gameplay, and it's just got to be fun. Sticking too slavishly to that then can sort of start to strip a little bit of the fun away. Kingdom Come Deliverance, for example, that game, when it first released at least, did have some criticism that, maybe it's almost too accurate with the mechanics. Maybe the accuracy is getting a little bit in the way of the mechanics, or at least, some people thought that. Of course, it's now releasing lots of DLC, so apparently it was all good. But it's definitely then a consideration. When is it just not fun anymore? Because it's a game. It's got to be fun. It's not a documentary.
The conversation is making me think a lot of Red Dead Redemption 2, which of course was a big blockbuster game that came out a few years ago, set in this kind of Wild West. And, I think that game has sparked a lot of debate because they're kind of towing that line of realism and authenticity, especially in the animations. Like there's so many things that are very slow. Thierry, you were talking about riding your horse through an open world, right? There's not a lot of fast travel. A lot of the animations are slow, like opening drawers and hunting animals and skinning animals. There's like a lot of things that are repetitive. And yet a lot of players are into that. They find themselves kind of mesmerized, and they say that this adds to the sense that they're really involved in the world, and they get that sense of engagement that we're all looking for when we're playing games. So, do you have examples of other games maybe that have kind of pushed that envelope of hyper-realism or hyper-authenticity?
I have one that I like particularly. To me, it's extreme authenticity, called Dead in Vinland. And about first colonists, Viking colonists in Vinland, supposedly in America, Northern America, and you're supposed to survive, and it's nearly impossible to spend the night. It's really extreme.
As it would have been back in those days.
Exactly, but finding wood, starting a fire, everything becomes very, very complicated. It's super nice example. I mean, the message is very strong about what is to survive and about how it was extreme. I mean, to go to such places at that moment. But I can understand, on the other hand, that the fun might be limited.
Sure.
It's all about understanding, your target market. So, that's why I come from the marketing perspective. Who are your core target market? Who are your core players? What do they actually want? So we see in a similar example, some people say, you know, the Souls games, they're too hard. Some people say, I can't play it. But that's the audience. They like the challenge. They like the hardness, you know. So who are your actual players? Are you targeting a mass kind of player market? Do you have someone much more specific in mind? What are their values? How much time do they have on their hand? What kind of other games do they play? All of that is also going to influence how you foreground the authenticity versus the accuracy and how that comes into play with the mechanics and so on.
Well, I know that you're really interested, as you said, in marketing. And so can you talk a little bit about how authenticity plays in like development of IPs and franchises as well?
It's really interesting because we think about authenticity a lot in terms of, you know, historical and fact and whatever. But, you know, almost anything can be authentic or not authentic. And that includes, you know, brands, not even just video games. But let's say, you know, video games. You know, let's say you've had a video game and it's, you know, on its 4th or 5th iteration or sequel or whatever, and it's maybe dropped some mechanics or dropped some gameplay features, or maybe even just dropped some characters that have been there present in, say, all of the last 4, 5, 6, whatever iterations. Is that going to feel like an accurate game? You know, I remember when The Sims 4 first came out, you know, there weren't toddlers, there weren't repo men, you know, there weren't burglars. There wasn't the absolutely terrifying burglar music from The Sims 2, which made us all absolutely traumatized as kids playing it. Seriously, if that music still plays, I still get the flight or fright instinct. I'm just like seriously. Sims 2 players know what I'm on about. It was hardcore. But people wanted it. Didn't feel like an authentic Sims game when The Sims 4 first came out and didn't have those features. You couldn't drown Sims in pools anymore. What were they thinking? Isn't that like half
Is it still a Sims game if you can't drown your character in the pool?
I know, right? Or, you know, not have the guy come and take all your stuff because you didn't pay your bills because you totally forgot, not because you were totally broke. Sure, that's my story. But so definitely things can just not feel, you know, authentic to what came before. So it's definitely applicable to IP as well, and not even just in the game space.
Well, I'm thinking of Star Wars as you're talking because I'm watching Andor, which I'm really enjoying on Disney Plus, and you know, I was kind of at the beginning I was kind of like, do I need this series in my life? And then I started watching, and I was like, absolutely, this is amazing. And there's a lot of discussion in the community that I'm seeing, for example, on Reddit about, you know, is this Star Wars? Is this not Star Wars? The Star Wars people, of course, are saying that Star Wars is a big enough universe that you can kind of fit all kinds of different stories in it. But, you know, there are no stormtroopers. TIE fighters appear. I've watched just a few episodes. TIE fighters appear in like the corner of a screen in one scene, you know. So it doesn't have the usual kind of Star Wars elements that you would expect. And yet it still feels legitimate to the Star Wars, in my opinion, to the Star Wars universe, because it's kind of showing the behind the scenes of the bureaucracy of the Empire and the birth of the rebellion and so forth. But these conversations, I think, are happening in a lot of different franchises as these IPs are expanding across media, as we're seeing a ton of different new games and series and movies coming out, right?
I've got to say, I really thought you were going towards Last Jedi when you mentioned Star Wars. Really got to say that. I was not expecting Andor. Got to say, it does have Coruscant. You know, that's
exactly.
Star Warsy. There is Coruscant. Also, it's, you know, Cassian Andor from Rogue One. Of course, we needed this series.
I totally agree. Cassian Andor is enough to justify the existence of it.
100%.
We needed more Diego Luna in our lives. When I think about authenticity in games, of course, there's historical authenticity, which we've talked a lot about, and you know, Ubisoft, we think a lot about it with Assassin's Creed. I think there's like authenticity in terms of gunplay and gameplay, which I know, Thierry, is less of your specialty, but I know we have teams at Ubisoft that, you know, collaborate with military personnel or ex-military or even firearm companies in order to really authentically represent those arms in some of our shooter games. I think about authenticity in terms of place, like Watch Dogs Legion, the representation of London. Of course, a lot of games are set kind of everywhere in the world, so we want to show those places accurately. But I think there's also authenticity that goes beyond the like physical objects, right? Because you talk about language language, it makes me think about authenticity in terms of cultures, of thought, how people reacted to things. Do you work in that area at all?
To me, the main challenge, perhaps the most difficult and the nicest thing, is to recreate non-material culture. How people interact, how they thought, how they reacted to elements, representation in societies, misconception, biases, discrimination in society, representing a society, how it worked, its values, its nicest and darkest aspect. Yes, this is certain. It's perhaps the most rewarding when you make people feel that you're bringing them to a different time, different period, in periods that people thought differently and lived differently.
And how do you do that? How do you create, what are the mechanisms by which you're able to recreate those, for example, how people thought or...
Dialogues are a good example. Every interaction, building characters, it's especially through people, but you send many messages. You can send many messages, including through architecture. So the way to organize a city, to have people interacting. I think we usually do, it's not corporate to say so, quite a good job in city life and urban life and daily life. It's all the small things you see when you're playing the game and which are all around you, and perhaps you don't really know it, but which give you information about the period you're in. Good example, of course, Paris during the French Revolution in Unity.
Jacqueline and Thierry, do you have any other examples of forms of entertainment? It can be specific novels or TV shows or movies or games that do an interesting job, according to you, in this space of authenticity and realism.
I always like to talk about a cute little city builder called Pharaoh from 22 years ago and now. Partially,
I remember that game.
So good, right? Partially because I do love my ancient Egypt, but, we're talking, it's a city builder, right? And it was made 22 years ago. It's pretty simple. I think the entire game's like 500 MB or something. So there's not a lot of resources packed into that thing. And yet it actually gives you a relatively speaking, again, for the genre and the year it was made, a relatively authentic / accurate portrayal of, Egypt. I love the little details that where we know it, they put the Egyptian name first. So not Memphis, Mennefer. Which, that's a nice little nod. You also, as you continue to build cities, you do very roughly follow ancient Egypt's history. And when you finally sort of jump away from history and, ta-da, suddenly you're Pharaoh, that is actually a point in the Middle Kingdom where there's some evidence there could have been a usurpation. It's pretty fragmented, we don't know for sure, but that is not an accident that it's that point that it starts to diverge and have you become the Pharaoh. So there's lots of ways that games and kind of any sort of entertainment media can use authenticity, can use history, can use facts and do it in a really creative, innovative, interesting sort of way. So I think there's authenticity in a lot of places, if you look carefully or if the creator has been careful with some of their intentions.
Yeah, I was going to say, if the creators kind of did the work, as Thierry was saying, right, they can plant those things in at the right moments or in the right ways to create those glimmering moments of authenticity.
Exactly.
Thierry, do you have any examples you'd like to bring up?
I like when authenticity appears where you're not expecting it. I was recently, I came back to play to Bioshock, the Bioshock series. Yeah. I like the idea that you have a totally fictional city and a fictional world, but which supposedly takes place in 1960, referring to things about the 40s, two elements of the 40s, and how they recreate yes, what would have been that kind of dream city and nightmare city, finally nightmare city, of the period with all those small elements which make it feel authentic. I mean, you can feel the 40s until the 60s all around with the technology you handle, with all the things you see. And you can feel it when it's absolutely fictional. I mean, so that's a really nice job. I think it's really great when you're really in a purely fictional part, and you managed to bring your authenticity in it.
It's attached to certain references from our history or the real world, but it makes something that's fantastical or fictional feel more authentic.
Exactly. That's the same with Wolfenstein. Wolfenstein does not pretend to be a documentary about the Nazi years, clearly, but actually it refers. You can see the Third Reich kind of art and technology, how it could have evolved, obviously in a fictional way, but yes, it's interesting. If you read the small articles of newspapers, it's pretty accurate in the way a world where the Third Reich would have unfortunately won, how it would have evolved, its relation with its allies, Japan, Italy, or something. The fact is, it's really great. It's a really great job of authenticity in a purely fictional world.
I have a last question for both of you, which is kind of a broader question about the responsibility that creators have, game developers or writers or the teams behind TV shows and TV series. What is the responsibility that they have to their audience in terms of authenticity, according to you?
I think it's always about understanding the audience and what are the expectations of the audience. In marketing, perception is reality, expectation is reality. If you think No Man's Sky, for instance, it's a good game, but because of the marketing and the communication and the promotional materials that had come out, expectations had been raised and crafted to a certain point that it simply couldn't meet. So I do think some of it's very similar. Some games, Assassin's Creed included, have talked a lot publicly about all of the research that they have done and how they've used historians, how they have consulted all of these documents and so on. So that's something that needs to be really considered, is what is that doing to the perceptions of your audience? And then are you following through and delivering on that? Because that's basically where we see, from a marketing perspective, anything bad that's going to go wrong is going to come into that expectations gap. We always talk about you want to slightly under-promise and then over-deliver. So you need to understand the expectations. You need to be careful not to shape them into a certain way that you cannot meet. And then plus you've also got what some people might consider almost the moral or ethical duty to, what actually was happening in this time, how much does it resonate, how important or how significant is it? And, these might be people who have now descendants living, or depending on how close you are getting up, there might be a lot of people now who do remember or did live through that time period. And that's some bit of criticism. The Crown, the TV series, is now starting to get it too. So you've kind of got the moral, ethical kind of dilemma, but you've also got then the expectations dilemma as well.
Almost like the promise, right? For that first point, it's the promise that the creators make with their audience, and then whether or not they'll be able to deliver on that promise.
Exactly. And if you don't deliver, and the players or the fans or the audience get annoyed at you, from a marketing perspective, all on you.
I absolutely agree. Once you decide, one does not have to be authentic. It's a choice. At the moment you create a game or a series or film. But pretend to be authentic, willingly or not, you're perhaps not doing a history class, but yes, you're writing pages of history. Yeah. So you have a certain responsibility once you pretend. If you pretend to be authentic, to be actually, even more if you pretend to be accurate, you have a real responsibility toward your audience. And ethically speaking, I mean, you're not to be reconstructing a misconception or reinforcing misconception, biases, discrimination, right, especially. And it's clearly a responsibility of all of us to realize that yes, we're influencing the perception of people about history. So yes, we're somehow making a learning or teaching job, and we have to be very conscious about it.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you both for taking the time to talk with us on this topic. It was really interesting, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The 10th Art. Make sure you don't miss any of our episodes as they come out. Subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts. Ubisoft.com/The 10th Art Podcast.